Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to the special edition of Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Undiano. Today we're going to be talking about ISIS and the most recent developments in Syria and the Middle East. My guest for today's show is a distinguished expert on Syria, Dr. Joshua Landis, who is director of the University of Oklahoma Center for Middle East Studies and a frequent commentator for electronic and print media around the world. You won't want to miss this special one-hour show. I would like to talk, if you don't mind, for just a little bit about some recent history that I think is kind of can be a stumbling block for people, trying to understand what's going on right now with ISIS and Syria. Could you take us back a little bit, maybe to the Arab Spring of 2011, where in some ways the trouble really started in Syria?
Arab Spring starts in Tunisia. A young man immolates himself because he's frustrated. He's push cart. The police are harassing him. They won't let him do it. He doesn't see any escape. And this sets off a string of public uprisings, of popular uprisings against authoritarian regimes. Two stories, two narratives began to emerge. And in America, we got caught up in the narrative that this is a revolt for democracy, for freedom. And
people are tweeting and they're celebrating ahead of time.
And they're furious at these dictatorships who've been ruling them for 50 years. And it rips through the Middle East. It gets to Syria, where there is a very tough dictatorship. There are a number of new problems. That is, sectarian religious differences amongst Syrians that causes a whole bunch of people, particularly the religious minorities, to support the dictator, the President Assad. And there's another narrative, which is the Middle East has been badly governed for 60 years. There's been a population boom. There's a giant youth bulge of young people with no jobs, no job prospects, bad government, growth of 3-4%, but a year in the economy, but the population is growing at 3%. So it's been zero growth, roughly. And you've got tons more people who cannot be bought off by the state through subsidies, job programs, and so forth. And these states are failing. Prices are going up, commodities, there's a drought, and the environment's being degraded. So standard of living, particularly for the lower 50%, is being clobbered. And people go into, and this is another trigger for these revolts. And so you have two different narratives. One is, this is a breakthrough, we're going to get to democracy. The other is, this is a meltdown, and we're going to get the chaos and the collapse of the state.
But in the case of al-Assad, there does seem to be a kind of taste in the Middle East for a strong man who can kind of keep things orderly. He certainly did that. He was in power from 2000 on. His father was in from 1970 to 2000. Was it just that he was just too repressive and they were tired of it, they were angry?
Well, it's a number of factors. His father took power in 1970 after there had been, for 20 years, the French left in 46. And for 20 years, there had been off and on coup d'etats, failed coup d'etats, revolving governments, terrible insecurity that was slipping towards civil war. Assad takes power and uses traditional values, family in the top security positions, his own sect, religious sect, the Alawites, who are only 12%.
No, you're talking about the son.
This is the father.
The
father does the same thing, and the son is just following the father. And jams up the security situation full of Alawites and other minorities, Christians, Druze, the religious minorities who are worried that if the Sunnis take power, they'll be marginalized and there'll be Islamic fundamentalism, which will look at them as unbelievers.
But wasn't there even some talk and expectation for a while that the son, al-Assad, might be a little kinder, gentler version. There might be a little more democracy, might be a little more free play. Wasn't there some good expectation for a while?
There was, and he did do some new things,
Yeah.
like bring in the internet, let a foreign investment in, new hotels. He tried to sort of neoliberal reforms to get away from the old socialist model where the state was providing everybody with everything,
Yeah.
let in foreign investment, privatize. The trouble is that led to lots of corruption, and he abandoned the basic contract with the poor, with the peasants and the working class. The state had always offered them jobs, some level of security, even if they were bad jobs. And he started cutting the subsidies, and their standard of living collapsed. And it's really in the countryside that this revolt against the Syrian state, against Assad, begins.
Just too repressive.
It's too repressive, but also the countryside was abandoned.
The other thing, while we're talking about this recent history that I think Americans stumble over a lot, you already mentioned Sunnis and, you know, the Shia people on the other side. And if somebody tries to Google this and they read a Wikipedia article or whatever, it's not going to immediately be clear. You know, can you talk about that hostility just a little bit? I mean, this runs really deep in the region, Sunni-Shia division, right?
It does. And there's even another layer of it, which is that the Alawites, who are a Shiite heterodox sect, are considered by Sunni fundamentalists to be non-people of the book. That means Abrahamic tradition. That means they're not Christians, Jews, and Muslims, all of whom are seen in Islam as descended from God, that God has given these three books, the Old Testament, New Testament, and Quran, in succession, and that they're all descended from God.
Yeah.
These other minorities are seen to be beyond the pale. And therefore, in this world which has not accepted separation of church and state, not accepted secularism, there's a deep hostility and sense that these groups, these religious groups, are illegitimate. So even the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic groups that were the big opponents of Assad when he first came to power in 1970, the father, they defined him and said, this guy is an apostate, and all Alawites are apostates, and we have to carry out jihad against them, and we can fight them and kill them.
Okay.
So that level of criticism was always boiling under the surface. Now, what did Assad do in response? He cracked down on them. He threw tons in jail. He executed at least 20,000. And this just caused, instead of having an open discussion, it caused
Like gas on a flame.
Gas on the flame. And so relations between the different sects got worse and worse.
Well, isn't there just sort of conditions of problems too, in that the populations of Sunni and Shia people, I mean, it's really lopsided. I mean, most everybody's Sunni, right? I mean, 75,
in
maybe
Syria,
90%.
everybody's Sunni. In Syria, Sunni Arabs are 70%.
Yeah.
Kurds, different ethnic group, different language, are 10% in the north.
Yeah.
Then there are 20% religious minorities. That's Alawites, Christians next, which are about 6%, 5, 6, 7%, and Druze and Ismailis, little other Shiite groups. But so it's 20 religious minorities, 10 Kurds, ethnic minority, 70% Sunnis. But in Iraq, it's exactly the opposite.
Right, right.
The Shiites are the majority there, and they had been ruled by the Sunni minority. So it was like the sort of negative opposite. In Syria, the Shiite minorities were ruling the Sunni majority. In Iraq, the Sunni minority ruling the Shiite majority. And in both countries, it was the colonial powers that had set up these minorities to rule, to sort of divide and conquer.
So I think maybe it would help people to maybe remember that across the region, people are mainly Sunni.
In the Arab world, they're almost all
almost, and there's a minority of Shiites, and then, but especially in Iraq, Iran, Bahrain, a few other places, they are
big Shiite populations. There are about 20% Shiites, 15 to 20% Shiites in the entire Islamic world. That's 1.5 billion people. 20% Shiites, 80% Sunni.
At one point, you said Sunni fundamentalists. Would it be a kind of hook that people could hang things on to say the Sunni side is probably a little more fundamentalist? They don't think there's been a lot of revelation since the time of Muhammad. The Shiites maybe are like sort of like liberal Catholics. You know, they a little more accepting of modern technology, seen as a little more free play in the region. Would that be accurate?
It's not an exact comparison. the Shiites have been the minority in most of the Arab world, whether it's in Bahrain, they've been ruled by the Sunnis, whether it's in Lebanon, Syria. So they have been more the supplicants. They've been discriminated against, and they haven't had rule. The Sunnis who've fallen from rule in places like Iraq, who are under the Assad government, see themselves as the natural rulers, and they feel that something very unnatural has happened to them now that Shiites have gained power. So it's, I guess I wouldn't want to say that they're more enlightened and liberal. Of course, Shiites will say that to you, but it's, but you see in Iran, they're still trying to rule through a theocracy. So it's not that the Iranians have accepted separation of church and state and Enlightenment ideas more than Sunnis. They both have their own worlds, but the minorities tend to be less expansive and believe that they are that everybody should believe like them.
Right. So this is going to be an orientation that if people recognize, if we're talking about Sunnis or Shiites, it's going to give them some understanding of the tensions, because the tensions run deep between those two groups.
They do, and they've particularly run deep today and since the Iranian Revolution in '79, because the Islamic Republic in Iran, once it took power and said, we're going to help bring up Shiites throughout the Arab world and make them equal. We're not going to stand for them being discriminated against anymore. It caused all kinds of havoc in the Arab world because Sunnis had been traditionally, they assumed that they were the rightful rulers.
Right. There's a lot of talk now about the rise of ISIS and a lot of finger pointing that somebody dropped the ball, one country did, or a political party didn't focus enough. You spoke a moment ago about failed states in the Middle East and Syria kind of falling apart because the Assad family was too strong, there was too much anger, civil war starts, it gets out of control. Is that what created the conditions that made ISIS possible? The vacuum left by failed states and chaos, and then ISIS basically comes in and starts to fill it?
Well, that's a good question, because this is at the center of debate today. Who is responsible for ISIS? And once you can answer that question, you can try to figure out how to destroy it. And there is zero agreement on this, because the Sunni opposition in Syria says Assad's responsible. Because you have bad government and you have an evil Shiite dominating the Sunnis, you have to destroy that evil Shiite government. Then Sunnis will go back to being the moderate, nice guys that they are. The Assad state and Russia today are saying, no, that is completely false. What's happened is that you've got failed states, and in those failed states, extremists can expand. And they say, look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at Yemen. America thinks they're going to go in, do regime change, bring democracy, and what do you get? You get a failed state, and into that failed state, every extremist group under the sun who thinks they're going to build a caliphate or something weird is going to expand because there's nobody to destroy them.
You know, according to what you're saying, if we could somehow magically go back in time and just take ISIS and pull them out, they're not there at all, they're not a factor, with everything you're saying, somebody else would still be in that space. Somebody else is going to come in and sort of take over where there's chaos.
That's true. And what's been unleashed in Iraq and Syria is an ethnic, religious struggle. Because the state has failed, everybody is trying to rebalance the ethnic balance. The Sunnis want to get rid of the Shiites from on top of them and minoritarian rule. In Iraq, it was the same thing. The Shiites want power, which they had never had for 1,400 years, and the Sunnis get driven out, and they're fighting for a hunk of the state back. So these failed states have unleashed this ethno-sectarian war, and it's very hard to put that back into the box.
Well, the other piece of this I want to bring in is the U.S., and particularly President Obama's decisions to be kind of a little bit involved in Syria, but not very much, and that kind of back and forth that he's gotten into. And there's a lot of finger pointing these days that said, look, if Barack Obama had handled this differently and had focused on what was happening with ISIS, we just wouldn't have this mess. What do you say about that?
I have some sympathy for President Obama not wanting to get involved in Syria and trying to get us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, because we've gotten ourselves into these ethnic battles, which we are not good at adjudicating and building a new state where you're going to have power sharing and so forth. We've tried that in Iraq for the last, 12 years, and we're clearly unsuccessful because ISIS has taken over the Sunnis again. Terrible struggle. We don't want to side with the Shiites too much against. So, in a sense, America is damned if they do, and they're damned if they don't. If they step in and try to nation build and adjudicate these problems, they get sucked into this very long nation building process, which is very expensive. If they don't do anything and take on these, then you get a failed state where the extremists run rampant. And we tried to stay out of Syria, but of course we get Paris. And there's the threat of further bombings in the West.
I think what you're saying is, if we could go back to the moments of decision in the 2000s, around 2008, 2011 with the Arab Spring, et cetera, there just weren't a lot of good choices for the U.S. Is that right? I mean, we weren't going to jump in and do Afghanistan and Iraq all over again. That just, there wasn't any sympathy for that in the U.S.
I think there's a bad choice. If we go back to Afghanistan after 78, 79, the Iranian Revolution, Russia thought, okay, I'm going to step into Afghanistan. I can snatch it because America's main gendarme, our big police state in Iran, has collapsed. And how did we try to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan? By arming fundamentalists and these mujahideen, people carrying out jihad, and use Islam against Afghanistan. That started, in a sense, this long snowball, because what did we get out of doing that? We got bin Laden and 9/11. Then we tried to destroy bin Laden and al-Qaeda by occupying Iraq. And what did we do? We destroy the state there, and it turns into al-Qaeda heaven. We want regime change in Syria by kicking over these very tough but unpopular dictatorships. We've opened the door for the spread of al-Qaeda. And we're trying to jam it back into the box and rebuild these states, but we don't really know how. And so we've gotten ourselves in a situation where the more we kick over sandboxes, the more chaos and the more al-Qaeda, spreads. So we don't really know. It's a hot potato, and we don't know how to deal with it. And we've tried to deal with it by just getting rid of the dictator and not having a big footprint like Libya, turned into chaos. We've tried to do it by having a negotiated change of power in Yemen, chaos. Full-on occupation, Iraq, chaos. So we don't, we've tried several different, and we haven't come up with a good answer.
The point you make, and it's kind of a frightening one in a way, is that even with what we know now, if we could go back to 2011 and say, let's make a better decision, it's very hard to come up with a better alternative than what we did. I mean, every way you go, there was really, really big trouble.
Well, and what it comes back to is that there's intense pressure on these very weak states that are dictatorships, that are holding together very fractious nations that are not really nations. And globalization, the pressures of population boom, modern life, how competitive it is, and every American knows just how competitive it is trying to get your kids educated enough and with the skills so that they can compete and make money and be a middle-class person. In a country like Syria or Iraq or Libya, the chances of you getting your kid educated enough, competitive enough so that they'll have a real job and a crack at a good living are small. And those countries have failed to deliver what they need to deliver. And they're cracking. And there isn't a way, after 50 years of dictatorship and falling behind and not taking care of the population, not getting an education system, you can't just build it overnight. And we're going to see, I think that this is the big challenge of the 21st century, is the developed world dealing with third world countries that don't make it. We're used to focusing on the countries that are making it. China, India, South Africa, Turkey, Brazil. These sort of BRIC countries, as they're called, that are pulling their poor out of poverty, getting them into middle class life, competing with the West. All the factors are moving to these countries.
Right.
But there are a lot of countries that are not participating in that. And they've got bad government, bad education systems. You look at their spreadsheets, they're not getting into the middle class, and they're crumbling.
Speaking of the poor, let's go back and talk about the opposition. I think this will bring us up into the present, the opposition in Syria.
Right.
For a while, sometime after the Arab Spring started, it really looked to the U.S. as though we could align ourselves with moderate opposition groups, the ones that weren't Islamists in the way, weren't radical. And I think we spent maybe $1.5 billion with training and arms. And why didn't that work?
Well, you're right. We've tried 3 different iterations at organizing moderate opposition, and each of them has failed. And as each attempt failed, the radicals, like al-Qaeda or ISIS, took the arms away from the moderates and made themselves stronger.
That $1.5 million didn't go to waste. ISIS has it right now. They're making good use of it. Yeah.
Well, and we're bombing it. But the real problem is that the ideology that sells today in the Middle East is religious nationalism. And the opposition that has raised the banner of religious nationalism, the black flag of Islam, are al-Qaeda, ISIS, and these Salafist movements. And you can see they have force in the north of Syria, in the south of Syria. The non-ideological parties, the moderates, they're about 1,000 some odd different militias. They are really strongmen who've gotten arms, get their cousins and their friends to try to protect their village, maybe 3 or 4 villages around, from anybody else coming into their turf.
So they might have impact on 1,000 people, say.
They're very small.
Yeah.
They're scattered, and they're not capable of cooperating, because you go over 10 villages and you think that guy's an enemy because you don't know them.
Yeah.
So there's no national cohesion. And so as this dictatorial state has melted down, you've got clans, tribes, villages, and America's trying to herd these cats, and they don't come together. The Islamists are the only people that have figured out how to unite the population of Syria around them and really get them to sacrifice themselves and go all the way in a war that's become very dirty. You know, the liberals, the middle class, have left Syria. That's why there's 4 million people trying to get into Germany and Sweden and elsewhere, because they don't see a future for themselves. They don't see an end to this war, and they don't like either the right or the left.
So basically, if you are a moderate group, that probably equals not having very much power and only local impact. So this was, in a way, kind of a foolhardy thing. To try to back those moderates, spend all that money, and think that somehow that's going to solve this much bigger set of problems that we're trying to talk about now, having to do with the history and politics of the region. Moderates really just weren't connected to any of that.
Well, they've had a small point of view.
Yeah.
And you can support these guys, but they turn into warlords. They're willing to take arms and money from anybody who will offer it to them because they're protecting their village.
Yeah.
And if it's America one day that looks up, or if it's al-Qaeda the next day that's supporting them and saying, we'll help you protect, they will switch their allegiances overnight, depending on who can offer them the highest degree of protection.
Yeah. Let's talk about al-Assad for a little bit, if we could. He's lasted far longer than anybody thought, much more durable. Is he just a shrewd player himself, or is he somebody who's just seen the sort of opportunism of chaos, and if he just kind of rides it out, he'll maybe get to a better time later? What's going on with him?
Well, I think it's all of the above. First of all, he never lost support amongst his core followers, which are other Alawites who are terrified that should the Islamist militias win, they'll all be ethnically cleansed, that they'll come into their towns, rape and pillage. Mm-hmm. And they have plenty of indication that could very well happen, because it's happened on towns that have fallen. So they're going to fight to the death. And the Christians and other religious minorities have backed them up because they're worried about being ethnically cleansed. Now there's upper class Sunnis in the cities. Assad still rules over, even though he's lost, probably 80% of his territory. He still owns about 65% of the population of Syria that remains in the country.
ISIS controls what, about 50% of the
territory. They did at their greatest extent.
Yeah.
But they have a lot less people because they've got the desert. They've got the east of Syria. So Assad still controls the big cities, Damascus, Homs, Hama. And the upper classes, the middle classes that have remained, don't want the rebels to win. Even though they may sympathize, they may not like Assad, they're worried because there's just too many militias. They'll come in, break into their homes, steal their TVs, take their car, the schools will collapse, they won't be able to send it. So they just want security. And Assad has endured.
They're probably right about that, right?
A level of security.
If he had a heart attack and fell over tomorrow, and then his government just kind of, went to Paris or whatever, I mean, it probably would be chaos, right?
There would
I mean,
be
it would just be.
It'd be like
terrible.
Libya.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, that's not so bad because at least in Libya, it is 20, 30, 40 people being killed a day instead of 200, 250. That's the difference between having an Air Force bombing you and not. But it's not. Nobody wants it, because some people are going to be big losers. There's a lack of national cohesion, and everything in Syria today has been reduced to such a Hobbesian world because
bad options.
Bad options. 4 million people out of the country. Half of Syrians have been driven out of their homes. Don't have are living in tents or in apartments with tons of other families. People are so poor. There's tons of malnutrition. 80% unemployment or way underemployment.
Yeah.
So half the schools are shut down. I mean, the country is hanging by a thread. So most people in those calculations don't want to see any more disorder.
Okay, Assad is bad news. ISIS isn't going anywhere. The opposition isn't going to unite, but they're kind of dug in for the long haul. Why does America want to be in Syria? I mean, given the difficulty of all this, we go back and Obama drawing a red line and then redrawing the line, and well, if they use chemical weapons, we're going to do something. Well, maybe we're not. It's a bad history that's made us look bad. We've lost a lot of faith. Why do we want to be there so much?
Well, we don't really want to be there. I mean, I think that's the bottom line. Obama does not, he's spent 5 years trying to keep us out of Syria. On the other hand, it's next to Israel, it's next to Iraq, which we own, it's next to Lebanon, which we care about, and Jordan. We don't want to see the region collapse. We're trying to contain the violence in Syria, but it's getting out. Paris, 4 million refugees. Europe is groaning. If these refugees keep on flowing into Europe, we're going to see right-wing parties beginning to win elections in Europe. It's going to change the composition of the developed world. We're already seeing it reflected in our own national elections, where it's become a subject of debate. So America can't leave it, but we don't want to get involved too much. And so we see President Obama tinkering around the edges, but it's not a good solution. And it's leading to the growth. I mean, ISIS has expanded, and we see a failure to provide security for the world. And that's what people expect of the United States, and that's what Americans expect of the United States. So it's a very difficult, he can't leave it, and he doesn't want to take it on as a national project.
Just to say the obvious, I mean, ultimately, we do have national security interests in the region. The oil is there. If the region were to
protect Saudi Arabia and the Gulf.
We've got to protect Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So ultimately, we can't let it spin out of control. But it looks like we don't have a clear enough sense of the urgency of why we're there right now. So we end up half doing things, half understanding things, and it just seems like we've probably made it worse by not having a very clear policy that explains what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, I think you're right. We haven't found a way to deal with this spreading. We've been fighting a war on terror now for a long time, and suicide bombing, failed states, the growth of Islamic fundamentalism has expanded for the last 20, 25 years. And America has tried a number of different policies towards it, and none of them
I
have
get
really been
the
successful.
feeling just every now and then when I read about the coalition that U.S. heads up and the plan that we have. Ashton Carter, I take to be a pretty smart guy, Secretary of State. He took a long time to look at the plan when he came into that job last year, and sort of affirmed, yes, I think we've got a good plan. This is going to work. And when Paris happened, Barack Obama said, I'm not going to start talking in a bellicose way. I'm not going to start posturing. We've got a good plan. And we're going to just kind of stick to that plan. Is it possible that there is a plan that is better than it looks and that is working in a non-flashy way, and the United States is going to defeat ISIS down the road, and Barack Obama will be able to look back and say, see, I told you we were just sticking with the plan and you all were trying to pull me off course. Is that even a possibility?
You know, there is some truth to Obama's statements that we're winning the war on ISIS, in the sense that ISIS is poor. We have been destroying their sources of wealth, the oil,
trying to do it methodically.
Fairly methodically.
Yeah.
And they're beginning to prey on the people that are living under them. The people, we've got more and more indications that people are fed up. They're being tortured, they're being robbed, they're being overtaxed. ISIS is desperate for more money. But ISIS has, at the same time, jumped to other countries, like Libya, like the Sinai in Egypt. So ISIS is not just being contained to Iraq and Syria. It's a franchise, and there are other countries in distress.
You know, until very recently, the U.S. line was ISIS is not an existential threat.
JV team.
JV team, we don't really need to worry about them. They're sort of contained in the region. And then just, again, we're playing catch up. Suddenly, that is just evidently not the case. They're metastasizing all over the place.
They are metastasizing, and they're taking advantage of these failing states that we see in other parts of the world. And this confronts the United States with a dilemma. Do we see this as a policing action, where what we do is we arm up Homeland Security, we listen, we use counterterrorism, pinpricks to hurt them, but we don't occupy countries and try to nation build? Because the argument against doing that is that will suck out our energy and put way too many resources in countries like Iraq or Afghanistan, which are really not that important, and we were going to fail anyway. We'll become then the objects of an insurgency and get sucked in, like the Roman Empire, spending all their resources at the far edges of the empire. And that we can't afford to do that. The trouble is, when you ignore those places, they fester, and they become, it's hard to, Al-Qaeda and ISIS are smart. They haven't allowed themselves to be contained, which is what America's trying to do. They have found ways to jump out because there are other societies in distress where the central state's collapsing, it's not providing for the people, and their extremist ideology can catch on in areas of desperation.
You know, I think it's hard for people to know how to think about ISIS. On the one hand, these are the people that cut heads off and crucify people that they're against. I mean, they're just terrible. But I've seen a little bit of a move recently. I saw this on your website, Omar al-Wardi, basically saying, let's take another look. You know, you go in there and the trains are running on time and people aren't killing each other and there's a kind of decency. And it looks as though ISIS is trying to present itself like the Pirates of the Caribbean. Yes, we do some awful stuff, but that's off camera. When it comes right down to it, you look at what's happening on our ship, what's happening in the caliphate. It's decency, it's really order, it's kind of good stuff. I mean, it's kind of two views of them, really.
There are. Well, Omar al-Wardi is a friend of mine who I've known for well over a decade. He was a journalist in Saudi Arabia. His family all lives in Bukamal, and he's from the heart of the ISIS territory. He lost his job in Saudi Arabia not long ago. He went back and visited for over a month. Saw his mother, his brothers, and he realized, his mother said, we're better off now than we were before. Because before ISIS took over that big expanse of territory, there was militia chaos. There were 6 or 7 militias in his little town, and they were all fighting over the spoils. And so when you went out, you never knew who was going to demand something of you. You couldn't get any justice. With ISIS, even though you didn't like perhaps their overbearing style, they provided some governance. And that raises the problem that you cannot destroy ISIS by just bombing it.
You know, the
You've got
fact
to provide a better government. I mean, Insurgency 101 says in order to destroy an insurgency like ISIS, you've got to provide a better government. And that's demanding some kind of nation-building process. And that's what America does not want to get into. But we get into this vicious cycle. We can't just bomb our way out of this because people become more and more desperate, poorer and poorer, and they cling to organizations like ISIS.
I'm still kind of grappling with how to see ISIS, how to conceptualize it, because on the one hand, I really do get that if you can build infrastructure and create predictability in people's lives, you're doing, it's going to be convincing to people. They're going to like that. But ISIS, they're not investing in the caliphate. They're not investing in industry. They're not going to export things. They're not going to become a nation in the usual sense. They really are the Pirates of the Caribbean. They really are out there. It seems to be more of a kind of apocalyptic. It doesn't matter how we get to the end because we're all going to be at an end soon, and we'll be a part of it.
Well, it is apocalyptic. It is in some ways a throwback organization. I mean, if we think of the modern Middle East was run by caliphates, and a big caliphate in the Ottoman Empire, right up until the First World War. Now, the West conquered it, destroyed the empire, and put nation states. Said, all you people have to develop a new sense of political identity based around these nation states that we're creating for you. Now, that seemed to work, but more recently, we've seen the collapse of some of those nation states. And people have become impoverished. They're very insecure, militias running around. And so this apocalyptic groups and others like al-Qaeda have come forward and say, you know what's wrong? Modernity. The modern nation state and secularism is wrong. We have to go back to what we know, which was only 100 years ago, and recreate a caliphate, bring God's word back, and justice will prevail. It's a very simple message. Of course, it's impossible to do that in the modern world.
What do you have to add to your picture? I mean, your picture said, okay, here's the Middle East up to World War I, and then the West takes these ideas of what should be the nation states, like these cookie cutters, and brings it down and creates Iraq, Iran, and so on and so forth. Wouldn't you have to add to that picture and then kept those governments forcibly in power for so long, making them our client states like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and so on. So they were never governments in the sense of having support of the populace or roots that ran any deeper than being a client state of the U.S. I mean,
and we did that. We did that for a long time. We kept, we propped up these dictatorships, and the criticism was really with, President Bush, who said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to bring democracy to the Middle East. We're going to kick down these dictatorships, and there's going to be a domino theory that goes from one end to the other. And he really reoriented, it was percolating for some time, but he reoriented American foreign policy to taking a totally different look at these dictatorships, saying, we're not going to be on the side of the dictators. We're going to be on the side of revolution. And revolution has been very dangerous for the United States, but supporting dictatorships was dangerous too.
That's kind of a tough way to go because there's the oil issue, and if the region,
tinderbox.
If the region gets chaotic and we can't get to the oil, or the people we support can't get to the oil, but also we want to see democracy. Those two just don't work very well together. Order on the one hand, and then trying to bring democracy.
Well, the whole process, as you point out, the whole process of bringing nation states to the world has been an extraordinarily violent and chaotic process. If we think that the French Revolution and American Revolution, these twin democratic revolutions, if you will, or liberal revolutions, started this earthquake that changed the globe from being bishoprics, caliphates, empires, free cities, you name it, every political concatenation except for the nation state, to changing the globe into 193 nation states, which is what we have today, where everybody belongs to one of them. That's been, the last 200 years has seen this dramatic political revolution across the entire globe, reorienting tribes. Think of what's happened in the United States, where hundreds of tribes have been destroyed, and you now have a nation state, taken a civil war, all kinds of things that have challenged that, but it's emerged. That's a very bloody process, and it's been a bloody process in Europe. We've seen, the 30 Years' War of the First and Second World War, 30 million people killed in Europe to consolidate those nation states. And that's the process, in a sense, that's going on in the Middle East today with the Arab-Israeli conflict, with the Iraqs, Shiites and Sunnis, and it's a very bloody, messy process.
Now, go back to America for a second and our foreign policy. As I read your work and things you've said here today, it seems to come out that American policy right now towards Syria and the Middle East and ISIS is simply containment of problems. That is to say, we don't want anybody to win. We don't want anybody to prevail. We'll just watch people continue to kill each other. This is acceptable as long as somebody doesn't finally win out. Is that where we are?
You know, I think that is where we are.
Yeah.
The Russians are supporting Assad. We can't destroy him. We're not going to go to war against Russia. We're trying to destroy ISIS. Al-Qaeda and a bunch of Salafists have emerged as the strongest powers amongst the rebels.
What's a Salafist?
A Salafist is a fundamentalist.
Okay.
A sort of radical fundamentalist Islamist.
Okay.
And the moderate rebels have been defeated by the more radical rebels. So we don't like any of the major powers. There's three major powers in Syria: ISIS, Assad, and these rebel coalition, which has the Salafists, the Al-Qaeda at its heart. We don't like any of them. We're trying to keep them all weak. We don't want anybody to win because all the solutions look worse than the problem. And that's what's keeping this civil war festering. It's not just America, because Russia's in there too. The international community, whether it's the Saudis or the Turks or the Qataris, all have their militias they like, their side. They're stoking them up with arms and money. Enough so that they don't lose, but not enough so that any one side can win.
Now, and somebody add something else to the picture that you're painting right now. Russia comes on stage, plops itself down in Syria, seems to catch the U.S. completely off guard, establishes a base where they can base bombers, and there's talk that they've got another base almost ready now. Why did they care? Why do they want to be in Syria? Why do they want to involve themselves in what we always describe as kind of a swamp? You know, President Obama said, "You want to get caught in that swamp?" Well, they do. They're there. What's their deal?
You know, Russia and Putin has been trying to rebuild Russia as a major world power. And he looks back at the whole perestroika period as a period of great weakness and disaster for Russia. Syria is the Arab client. It's the oldest Arab client in the Middle East that remains pro-Russian. And if they don't have Syria, they have nothing in the Middle East.
So is this positioning for the future?
It's positioning for the future. It is their base too. It's an important base in Tartus. But it's their bridgehead on the Arab-Israeli conflict. If you look at all of Russia's position in the international world in the last few years, it's because the United States has to talk with Russia about solving the Middle Eastern problem. The UN appearance of Putin several months ago. All of these, the Geneva conferences, Vienna conference, Russia's at the table because they're in the Middle East. America's fought its last 5 wars in the Middle East. If Russia's not there, they're not involved in any of that. Mm-hmm. And now, every time the United States wants anything to happen in the Middle East, whether it's a treaty with Iran, Arab-Israeli conflict, Syria, ISIS, Russia is at the front of the table.
There's starting to be some talk now about eventual, down the road, federalization is the word I think that comes up in Syria. I think by that has meant a kind of balkanization. At some point, the world will recognize there are all these separate little communities, or almost like little nation states, and we'll just decide they can all sort of live together under federalization without being one country. Is that realistic? Is that going to happen?
I think it is happening.
Okay.
Assad and the Russians have taken the west of the country. You've got the Kurds, 10% of the population, but they've really carved out a long strip along the Turkish border in the north of the country. The United States has helped them. There are various rebel groups. Today, ISIS has a big hunk of that. Federalization is the wrong word. It's partition of Syria along these battle lines. And I think we're going to see them harden. And the attempt now is really to find a truce. That's what Putin and the United States have said they want to do. is to try to get ceasefires along these battle lines and get some kind of accommodation. And that means living with this fragmentation. Now, the hope would be that sometime in the distant future they would reunite, sort of like East Germany, West Germany. But that in order to stop the war, we have to recognize the balance of power the way it is and accept this a partition process, a Yugoslavia-type divide-up of Syria.
You said a moment ago that back in time, into the 19th century, early 20th century, the West imposes these nation-state boundaries in a way that made sense to the West but didn't always make sense to the people that are there. Basically, federalization of Syria would recognize that that didn't work. Here we are separate communities. The people that have been forced together, do they need to somehow find equilibrium in their own communities? You've used the term the great sorting out. You either drive the people out that you don't want to be with you, or you kill them, or you do something till the people who are left are happy to be with each other. I mean, is that the sort of ugly process that needs to play out?
That is a nation-building process, and we've seen it unfold across Central Europe and Europe. It's brutal. Groups that do not agree are treated as a fifth column, and they're suppressed or they're driven out of the country. And that's what I think is happening in Syria today. How, where the borders, eventual borders, are going to be drawn, whether people can reknit their relationships and live together. And rather than, like a Czechoslovakia, which at least peaceably split, but even after living together for hundreds of years, they could not agree on a common political community. They didn't want to live together. They separated. And that's what's happening with Kurds in Iraq and in Syria. And it may be what's happening between Sunnis and Shiites. We don't know to what extent that's happening.
So a kind of human nature and forces of history finally just resurface, and we're all just kind of knocked back, really. It's a kind of withering thought, and history's just going to have to play out for a while. Then we can come back and maybe find some order in what's left, basically.
And we see that happening in the
Tough
Arab-Israeli conflict, where the Jews have been kicked out of all of their cities, whether it's Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, and they've collected, formed a nation state, and in turn are pushing out Palestinians who've become refugees. Very brutal process of this great sorting out, where the Armenian massacres in Anatolia, where the Turkey just expelled them. There's no more Christians in Turkey. There used to be 20% of Anatolia, of Turkey landmass, was Christian before World War I. They're gone. And that process of this great sorting out, as I've called it, is, I think, very much alive today in the Middle East. And we've seen the Christians of Syria and Iraq almost disappear.
Hasn't the U.S. been historically, in the last maybe half century, just resistant to that notion that we are going to impose our will in the Middle East? We're going to have democracies that look like us, look like democracy in the U.S., where there just doesn't seem to be any chance that's going to happen. This historical great sorting out is going to happen no matter what we do, and yet the U.S. continues to foster this romantic notion of democracy in places where it doesn't have a chance. I mean, isn't that a pattern?
It is a pattern, and the Middle East has not been fertile ground for that ideology. Now, clearly Eastern Europe was, and Latin America has been a success. So there are reasons why America clings to this national religion of democracy and spreading democracy around the globe. But America has done that best, it seems to me, when we've allowed other countries to choose it by being an example and a well-working democracy, so that the world has wanted to emulate the United States, which it has done. In the modern period, everybody's wanted to be like America. We had all the wealth, we're going to the moon and so forth. And trying to impose it on the back of a tank has not worked, particularly in regions of the world where you have this ethnic religious fragmentation. In social sciences, today dominated by the search for what are the prerequisites for democracy? Why is it so difficult to impose democracies on countries like Libya or Syria or Iraq?
So another tension that really people might use to orient themselves is this kind of conflict between the notion of democracy as we conceive it, and then the kind of strongman regime that seems to prevail. There's a taste for it in the Middle East. Putin didn't seem to have to think about it very much at all. When Russia comes into Syria, he's going to be the strong man, empowering somebody else as a strong man. that really might work. I mean, that could actually work there.
You know, both, you look at Washington and Moscow, and both capitals look at the Middle East and they see the solution is themselves. And they want to emulate their own model and impose it on the Middle East. And Moscow says, America's stupid. The Middle East is not ready for democracy. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, you constantly try to do the same thing over and over again, impose democracy, tear down these states, these strongmen, and you get chaos and extremism. The Russian example is the right example for the Middle East, which is a strongman like me to rebuild these countries. In a sense, I think that Washington is sitting back on Syria, watching where the Russians go with this, because we've lost confidence in our model, the democratic model, and we're willing to give Putin some time.
Well, and if our official policy is containment, let the pot boil.
We're certainly not going to try to outbid him for Syria. It's not worth it to the United States. We did that in Afghanistan. We were sorry we did it. And I think that President Obama does not want to replay that movie in Syria.
What would defeat ISIS, at this point? I mean, do we have to think in terms of a great sorting out? Time needs to go by. There needs to be history needs to kind of work its magic, brutal as that is.
I do think that history is going to have to play itself out. I think what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years is a brutal widening of the income gap and the success rate in the developed world and the underdeveloped world. And there's a process of national development that is a very difficult process right now in the Middle East. We're moving from a very traditional society to these modern nation states that have to compete, and they're failing. And this is going to create a lot of tension. And we're seeing it, we're seeing that those tensions, that the nation is becoming selfish and is becoming captured by special interests. And I think that if you come from a third world country that's not making it, where your government is not looking after you, you're susceptible to these radical ideologies because you don't know where else to turn, because there's no other solution for you. And you're going to pick up, if you're a young kid and these youth bulges, you're 18, 19, 20, you don't see another solution. And somebody comes preaching God, apocalypse, join me, we're going to take you. And, with this incredible propaganda machine that ISIS has put together, it's a toxic brew, but it's a very attractive one to a young person who wants to be a hero and make something of themselves and sees just nothing but shut doors in front of them.
Do you think it's probably true that on the American side, people in the State Department, where there are people like yourself who are experts in the region, that they see these tensions that we're talking about between the strong man and the democracy is not anything that's going to catch on very soon in the Middle East. And, they know that this has to play out, but in the meantime, officially, the United States needs to talk about democracy in the region, and basically platitudes that ultimately mislead people and make us look a little bit naive, as though we're always playing catch up.
I think that's exactly where we are today. We've got these set of talking points: democracy promotion. We're going to be on the side of human rights. We don't support dictators who gas their people. We stick to those as our answer, even though we can see that they aren't going to bring a solution. That what you need to do is get down and compromise between two forces that are not good. But you don't see in Syria, there's no desire to get in there and be the nation builder. And so you just stick to these platitudes, as you say, which look increasingly hypocritical. But what is a government official supposed to do?
Yeah,
is he supposed to say, oh, Assad's okay, you can live with him some more? You can't say that kind of thing. So you don't.
I think it's difficult for people because if somebody really tries to educate themselves on what happens in the region, it's like turning a light on and the room just gets darker, somehow. The gap between what we say we're doing and what's actually happening in the region and what's possible in the region is just, as you've been saying, enormous.
It is enormous, and it leads to this hypocritical stand of the United States saying to Syrians, we care about you, and we're going to help you fix your situation. And then spending almost no money on it, shutting the door to immigration,
right,
and basically praying that Europe will do something about it. The Russians will do something about it, and they're gonna be the ones who eat the fallout. They're gonna take all these immigrants because they're not gonna, get in their rubber dinghies and come across the Atlantic. And that is, in a sense, I fear the fallback position. That's the real foreign policy of the United States.
Okay, fearless forecast time.
Okay.
You have a crystal ball, and you're going to look down the road
Yeah.
for Syria in the region a year, maybe 3 years out. In the near term, in the next year, what do you see happening that might surprise us, that you think will be maybe a game changer, change direction a little bit, and then maybe a little bit further out?
Well, I think, Russia is supporting Assad, and he's regained a bunch of territory. He's here to stay. Will the United States and Europe accommodate themselves to that and figure we've got to really work on getting ceasefires? That's going to be the big question. Or do we stick with the platitudes and say democracy, even though we know it's impossible? If we face into the reality of having to work with Russia, accommodate some kind of federalism as you've drawn out, and really begin to say it openly, I think we could get people to cooperate on this and probably bend many of the actors in Syria to that realization. I don't hold that very high because I think Obama's just trying to ride out his time, get the hell out of there. He's going to pass the ball, this very tricky problem, on to the next. And we don't know who's going to be next. And it's going to take them at least a year to get their administration up and going.
Get up to speed and see the things that basically you're talking about here today.
Right. And what we see happening as a result of Paris is that the French and the other Europeans are going to become big spenders on homeland security.
Yeah.
And that's what's really happening in Europe. It's not that they're going to war against ISIS, but they're going to war in their own countries to reorganize. Because if you look at the United States spends about $40 billion a month on homeland security. In Europe, it's about $500 million. In France and in Germany, big disparity. And Europeans, aren't gathering all this information. They aren't doing the things. They aren't spying on their own people and gathering. And they're going to have to do that. And that's what I think is really happening in Europe, is this is becoming a policing problem, and that personal liberties are going to go.
Joshua Landis, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
I'm especially glad that you could be with us today. Join us next time for more current conversation. Thank you for watching.